Clearly, lots to get us into right now. Joining me to discuss this is TalkTV's international editor, Isabel Oakeshott, and Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. It's a foreign policy and security think tank. Isabel, I'll just start with you. How shocked were you to learn of this story? You know, it's been developing over the last few days, and now we get the identity of the person in question.
Well, I think the biggest shock is just to see that identity, that this is a relatively young man from an affluent Scottish family. There's no obvious Chinese heritage there. He went to public school. You're left wondering what on earth was the motivation for this individual, if indeed he is guilty of what he is accused of doing, which he staunchly denies. What was his motivation? How did he get drawn into that? And you're absolutely right, as you said in your intro, there is fury in defence and foreign affairs circles in Westminster tonight at the handling of this, and that this could possibly have been allowed to happen. A lot of anger directed at some of the key individuals, Li Qiang and To Toughen Up, over there, what they did or didn't know and who was told what when. If we set that aside and look rather at the bigger picture here, I'm afraid to say that there will be a lot more of this in the Houses of Parliament. And it shouldn't just be the House of Commons that we're concerned about, but also the House of Lords. China is very, very good at this stuff, and they're subtle, they're discreet, and you know it can be quite difficult to identify who and where their assets are. But we should be in no doubt that they are crawling all over our political and other public life. Sometimes they're quite open in the way they do it. I've spoken a number of times about the number of Chinese representatives I used to see when I went to defence conferences here in the UK, where our own government was represented and senior military figures. We would never be allowed to do the same at Chinese defence conferences. And I think that for many people, the words of Oliver Dowden in his statement to the House of Commons today will stick in the throat somewhat. The repeated use of the word China being a challenge to us, his suggestion of reports of threats in the South China Sea. These are not reports of threats. China poses a very real, clear and present danger to the international rules-based order in the South China Sea and in many other places, trying to impede freedom of navigation and so on. And they are all over us here in the UK. We should not be naive about this.
Listening to that, Alan, you know, the Prime Minister, in the leadership campaign to be the PM, he said the biggest threat facing us is China. Do you think there is still some sort of naivety about the tactics that they might be using to sort of infiltrate, you know, all areas of society?
Yes, I mean, I think the reality is that, as Isabel has pointed out, the Chinese have been engaged for quite some time in a full-scale assault on us, whether it is in our democracy or our industry or our academia, to try and extract information, secrets, whatever is of benefit to themselves. This is indeed a very sophisticated style approach. It's much more akin to something you'd have seen during the Cold War, where a British national with no connection to China appears to have been turned by the Chinese, and there are potential reasons why that might have been the case, but it still is a sophisticated assault. And clearly, we have not taken seriously as a sort of collective, although obviously some of us have, the threat China poses. And that's really the sort of the battle the government is going to have to kind of look to engage in now. Get away from this talk about China being some kind of partner in any kind of normative sense, but instead to look at it as a threat it is, and to realise that there is no accommodating such a threat. You have to deal with it on a very serious and very formal basis, and make sure that you are not leaving your national security unprotected as a result.
Yeah, the question and the challenge for the Prime Minister is that we do, in some regards, as we keep hearing from senior cabinet members, we need China. We can't just sort of hold them out in the cold. Isabel, sort of big political conversations now about how you do that. I mean, Rishi Sunak's just been at the G20, spoke to the Chinese Premier head on and said, I raised a range of different concerns, particularly my strong concerns about any interference in our parliamentary democracy, which is clearly unacceptable. It's clearly unacceptable. How does Rishi Sunak navigate this?
Well, we know what you don't do, and it is, for example, allowing the Chinese regime and its funding and its allies to crawl all over our critical national infrastructure. You don't allow Chinese nationals to have large stakes in some of our most important utilities, for example. This is something the government has turned an absolute blind eye to over a very long period of time. You know, hugely important water companies, for example, have very strong Chinese links. So these are things that we need to look at very closely. And I am concerned that in Parliament, researchers, some of the most junior, highly intelligent people are low-hanging fruit to be brought under the influence of potentially hostile regimes or countries that don't necessarily, states that don't necessarily wish us well. I became concerned not that long ago about somebody who was operating in Parliament. I had a good look at them. Eventually, I concluded that they were not, in fact, working for a foreign state, but they could well have been. And I was slightly concerned at the lack of scrutiny that goes on.
I mean, Isabel, you've got a much better sort of insight into exactly how things like parliamentary passes get given out. Do you think maybe we've been too liberal with security, a bit lackluster on it, and maybe not doing sufficient vetting processes? I mean, we know this individual who's suspected of spying was very clear about his motivations to engage with issues around China. Do you think maybe there was some vetting that just didn't come up to the right level of scrutiny?
Well, I think all of that's going to come out, isn't it? It's a bit too early days to be too critical of the vetting. And, you know, he obviously doesn't naturally raise red flags. You know, he was working for an organization called the China Research Group. There are now real questions over what that really is up to and whether it has in some way been infiltrated at a more deeper level. On the face of it, I've just looked at its website. It's, you know, does perfectly legitimate things, but perhaps it can be exploited by those who don't wish us well. And we mustn't forget as well just how many pass holders there are at Westminster, some 14,000. I haven't checked the figure lately, but it was always around that number. So there are a huge number of people coming and going. It's very difficult to do a deep dive into each of those individuals. And remember, there's a lot of turnover. You know, parliamentary researcher may only stay a year. That would be quite classic. So a lot of resources have to go into doing a deep dive vet on people.
Yeah. Alan, Ian Duncan-Smith, former leader of the Conservatives, has said, look, the government's stance currently on China is weak. How should it toughen up, and does it need to?
Well, the obvious place that it needs to toughen up is to ensure that there are no monopolies from China on areas of critical national infrastructure or critical defence or critical health places, so that should there be a crisis of some kind, along the lines of, you know, a Chinese attack on Taiwan, for example, which has been obviously rumbling along in the background, and we sought to get involved, the Chinese could not turn off critical sectors of our economy by doing that. Now, we're a bit late to this party. There have been many years of research done into this already to point out the areas where we should be cutting ourselves loose from China's influence, but that needs to start now. And the key thing to it is to, you know, to explain to everyone in this country that, sure, you know, China's not the Soviet Union, say, but it is a threat to us, and as such, we have to react accordingly. It may mean sacrificing some trade income, but, you know, there are some things that are more important than money. National security is more important than money. The ability for a nation to act in a sovereign way is more important than money. And ultimately, in this whole debate about whether China is a friend or foe, China has repeatedly shown us that it is a foe, and it's time that we stop pretending otherwise and actually look to the evidence and responded accordingly.
That's exactly what the MPs will be pressuring the government, the cabinet in particular, to do. Alan Mendoza, Isabel Oakeshott, thank you both very much.